Hello, and welcome to this introduction to the Unease Modulation Model of Stress. The Unease Modulation Model is a revolutionary new approach to how we handle stress. By breaking down stress into different components, we can learn techniques targeted to each component and increase our effectiveness under stress in a sustainable and adaptive manner. These techniques in the model can be applied to the four major areas in life: performance, health and wellness, relationships, and spirituality. In this introduction course to the Unease Modulation Model, we will learn to identify the 5 components of stress and how they interact with each other. This will provide you with the basic knowledge you need to use this model effectively. The material presented here is for educational and self-improvement purposes only. It is not to be used for the treatment of any medical or psychiatric disorder. What is stress? Think of all the ways we use the word stress. We say, "That is stressful," to refer to something about our environment. We say, "I feel stressed," to refer to how we feel about a situation. And we say, "I am stressed out," to refer to physical sensations such as muscle tension, shallow breathing, or fatigue. Clearly, using only one word for several different experiences will cause confusion. Things get worse. We are told that the treatment for stress is stress reduction. We are told to breathe or be in the present moment. However, we are not told how doing those will be helpful. After all, we are already breathing. And for most of us, the present moment is what is causing us to be stressed. Let's pause for a bit and think about the patient who goes to the doctor because they don't feel well. The doctor does not tell the patient, "You are sick, you need sickness reduction." Instead, the doctor gives the patient a diagnosis and a treatment plan based on that diagnosis. We need to have that kind of precision with stress. That precision is what the Unease Modulation Model will give us. The Unease Modulation Model breaks down stress into 5 components. The first component is difficulty. Difficulty refers to the demands we face compared to the resources we have available to meet those demands. Difficulty is represented by the height of the yellow bar. Demands refer to our to-do list or agenda, anything that must get done now or later. Resources refer to the skills and assistance we have available to us. Resources can be internal, such as the physical, social, and cognitive skills that we have, or resources can be external, such as how much time we have, financial resources, the tools and technology available, or other people able to help us. The greater the demands compared to the resources, the higher the difficulty. Let's go through an example. If our task is to walk down the street, that is the demand. Our internal resources include our physical strength and our ability to walk. Our external resources include our shoes, the condition of the walking surface, and any tool we may use to help us walk, like a walking stick. If the street is flat with a sidewalk, and we have no impairment of our walking ability and are wearing shoes, then we have low demands and high resources, leading to low difficulty. But the difficulty will increase if demands increase without resources increasing as well. If the street goes up a steep hill, or if it is a gravel road with no sidewalk, then walking is more difficult. Difficulty will also increase if demands stay the same, but resources are less. Walking on the sidewalk of a flat street is more difficult if our leg is in a cast and we are on crutches. Again, difficulty is our to-do list, tasks, or agenda against the skills, tools, and assistance we have available to us. Difficulty is an external component of stress. It comes from our environment. Now let's look at difficulty using another example. Imagine the following situation. You are at one end of a sturdy board that is lying on the ground. The board is about 18 inches wide and 30 feet long. Your task is to walk from one end of the board to the other. That is the demand. Your internal resources for this demand include your ability to walk and your sense of balance. We can consider the width of the board to be your external resource. With the board 18 inches wide, the external resource is high and the difficulty of the task is low. If the board were narrower, say 6 inches wide, then the difficulty would increase. If the board were even narrower, say 2 inches wide, then the difficulty would be quite high. As the width of the board decreases, one of your available resources decreases, so the difficulty increases. Let's go back to the 18-inch wide board lying on the ground. It is so wide that walking from one end of the board to the other is an easy task for most people. Now imagine we take the same board and raise it between two skyscrapers 300 feet high. It is securely fastened at both ends and a very rigid board, so being in the air does not make it wobble when walked on. It is in fact the same board and the same task, but there is something completely different about this situation. The difference is the second component of the model, unease. Unease is represented by the height of the red bar. Unease comes from wanting something we don't have, or having something we don't want. In this example, we don't want to walk across the board at this height and risk falling, which causes high levels of unease. When the board was lying on the ground, the elevation was low, and so was our unease. The higher the elevation of the board, the greater our unease. This high unease causes the difficulty of the task to increase. Even though the board is the same width, for most of us, walking across a board that high in the air would be much more difficult than walking across a board on the ground. Let's look at unease more closely. Unease is our desire for something we want, or an aversion to something facing us. We can consider desire as wanting something we don't have. Desire often feels like a want or a need, a pull towards something, and when we obtain what we want, we feel relief or pleasure, and unease goes down. We can consider aversion as having something we don't want. An aversion can often feel like a push away from something, and when we avoid it, we also feel relief and unease goes down. The greater our desire or aversion, the more unease we feel. Unlike difficulty, which is usually something we think about, unease is something we feel, though it is not a specific emotion. Since feeling unease is very unpleasant, we instinctively focus on the unease and how to decrease it. However, what decreases unease may actually increase difficulty. Resolving this contradiction is one key to effective stress management. Let's go back to the board. You are standing at the edge of a building, looking out at a board that is 300 feet in the air going between two skyscrapers. Your task is to walk across the board to the other building. The actual physical demands of the task are low, as the board is securely attached, does not wobble, and our resources are high as the board is wide enough to walk on easily. So, based on our demands versus our resources, we would expect our difficulty to be low. Yet, we feel an aversion to being so high off the ground, to walking across the board with nothing except our own balance to prevent our fall. This aversion leads us to feel high unease about the task. This high unease causes our body to respond in ways that increase the difficulty. These body responses come from the third component of stress, activation. Activation is a physical process that energizes our body so we can meet demands. Activation is associated with our sympathetic nervous system, but other systems are also involved. Unease and activation are closely linked. The higher our unease, the greater our desire or aversion to a situation, the higher our activation. Activation is represented by the orange bar. So, as we look down at the board at our feet and see the ground far below, our unease increases, which in turn drives up our activation. Our heart rate will speed up, our palms may start to sweat, our knees may feel weak, we may have butterflies in our stomach. These are all examples of the effect of activation on the body, and these physiologic changes can increase the difficulty of a task. If our activation goes high enough, we may end up in a flight, fight, freeze state and be unable to walk on the board at all. But activation is not a bad thing. Activation is what enables us to wake up in the morning. As activation starts to increase, we feel more alert and more energized. At low and medium levels, activation can actually help us perform tasks by revving up our body to meet the demands. Let's imagine that instead of 300 feet in the air between two skyscrapers, the same board is 3 feet in the air above a swimming pool. Instead of being terrified and unable to complete the task, we may feel some excitement at the idea of walking the board. Our body will feel more energized. In fact, we may do a better job at walking across the board when it is 3 feet above a pool than when it is lying flat on the ground. That is because walking across the board on the ground does not give us any unease, and so activation remains low. The task has low difficulty, but it is also rather boring. When the board is above the water, we may have an aversion to falling in and getting wet, but it is a mild consequence compared to falling from 300 feet. We might not mind much if we fell and splashed into the water. This moderate level of unease will increase our activation to an amount that helps us walk across the board, without impairing our ability to walk or our balance. It is important to remember that activation is a physiologic process in our body, not an emotion. We experience activation both as physical reactions in our body, like heart rate, and as a feeling of pushing, or being revved, or amped, or energized. Exactly how we experience this activation will depend on our level of unease and on the fourth component of stress, modulation. We are back on the top of the building with the board 300 feet in the air. Our unease has shot up, causing activation and therefore difficulty to increase. At the same time unease is causing activation to increase, it causes another physical process, modulation, to decrease. Modulation is a physical process that regulates how activation is expressed through the body. When activation is high, increasing modulation allows us to direct our activation so we can use it effectively. When activation is low, modulation acts as a rest and repair system to help us recover from meeting demands. Modulation is associated with our parasympathetic nervous system, but other systems are also involved. Modulation is represented by the height of the blue bar. High unease causes modulation to decrease at the same time it causes activation to increase. When our unease goes up as we stand at the edge of the board high in the air, activation not only increases to the point where it can impair our abilities, but as our modulation decreases, we lose our ability to channel our activation effectively. Now, imagine that instead of the board being between two buildings 30 feet long, it is 500 feet long. The increased length we have to walk not only increases the demands of the task, but affects the final component of stress, reserves. Reserves refer to our experience of the physical and mental energy we have available to meet demands. We can think of reserves like banks of energy we can draw on. When reserves are full, we feel like we have energy. We often don't notice this, being more aware of fatigue when reserves are low. When reserves are critically low, then we can feel depleted, and even sleep is not restorative. The increased length of the board means it will cost us more of our reserves to walk across it. The most important aspect of reserves is that we have both short and long-term reserves. Short-term reserves are the ones we use on a day-to-day basis. They are quickly depleted, but also quickly recharged with a short rest, some food, or something else we find restorative. When activation is high, we use up our short-term reserves faster. Short-term reserves are represented by the height of the light green bar. Long-term reserves are the larger reservoirs of energy that we can draw on when short-term reserves are low. Long-term reserves are slower to deplete, but take longer to recharge. Long-term reserves are represented by the height of the dark green bar. When we experience high unease, that suppresses modulation, and we are unable to rest effectively, and therefore are unable to recharge our reserves as needed. Let's imagine the board high up in the air one last time and walk through all the components in turn. We approach the board, and our aversion to the height triggers an immediate increase in unease. In milliseconds, the increase in unease causes our activation to increase and our modulation to decrease. We feel our heart starting to pound, our breathing becomes more rapid and shallow, our legs may start to shake. The task is now much more difficult. If we do manage to walk out on the board, the high unease means we are unable to recharge our short-term reserves as we use them. If the board is longer, the extra distance we have to walk may mean that we use all our short-term reserves and have to start drawing on long-term reserves. By the time we reach the other building, we will be exhausted. Fortunately, the Unease Modulation Model provides a framework of methods and techniques to help us avoid this kind of outcome. We began by learning the 5 components of stress: difficulty, unease, activation, modulation, and reserves. These components and their interactions are the foundation of the Unease Modulation Model and for using it to handle stress effectively. Thank you for watching.